When you're in Google Search Console looking at different reports and trying to diagnose issues, one of the most helpful tools that you can use is URL inspection. URL inspection lets you look at a specific URL on your website to see how Google is crawling and indexing that particular URL. You want to use URL inspection on the most important pages on your website. And by using URL inspection on those most important pages, you can make sure that Google is handling those pages appropriately. So let's talk about how you can use URL inspection. There's a few different ways that you can access URL inspection. At the top of the page, you can paste in a URL, then hit enter, and then that will load the URL inspection report for that URL. You can also click URL inspection in the sidebar, and that will jump you up to the form at the top of the page. Also, when you're on some of the pages in Google Search Console, such as the page indexing report or the performance report, you'll hover over a URL and you'll see a magnifying glass. If you click that magnifying glass, you'll be taken into the URL inspection report. Once you're on the URL inspection report, you're going to view the crawled version of the page. This is the page as Google crawled it last. This is not necessarily representing the page as it is today. So for starters, in this top box, we can see that the URL is on Google. That means that this URL can appear in Google search results. I can click View Crawled Page to see how Google crawled it. I can see the HTML that Google crawled. It can be useful to scroll through this HTML and make sure everything in here is what you expect. Sometimes you see things sneak into the HTML that Google crawls. Some cases that's malicious with hacked content. In other cases, that's a plugin or something on your site that's doing things differently for Google, and you want to understand why that is. So that's helpful to compare this HTML to the HTML that you see when you access the page as a regular user, not as Googlebot. Under more info, you can also see what kind of response Google got when they crawled this page. Coming down to the middle section of this report, we can see whether or not the page is indexed or not. If we expand this, we can understand more about what's going on with the page indexing. At the top, we can see where Google discovered this URL. In this case, Google discovered the URL in our XML sitemap, and it also lists a couple of referring pages. These are not the only referring pages, but it gives you an example of where Google may have been finding this particular URL. Sometimes you won't see any referring pages listed, even though there probably are referring pages that allowed Google to find this URL. What you really want to check for here under referring pages is if there's anything odd. In this case, it is a little odd that Google is finding a referring page from the HTTP version of this URL, and that could mean that we have some backlinks or something they're still referencing the HTTP version of the page, and we may want to dig into that to see if we can update those to use the HTTPS version of the URL instead. The next section tells us when Google last crawled the page. So in this case, it last crawled this page on March 21st, 2024. So everything we're looking at here is as of that last crawl, as of March 21st, 2024. Any changes that have happened since then will not be reflected here. You can see how Google crawled this particular page, in this case as a smartphone bot, so they're looking at the mobile version of the page. You can see if crawls are allowed or not. If crawls allowed says no, that means that there's a disallow on the robots.txt file that prevented Google from crawling this page. Next, you can see whether or not the page fetch was successful. They might be allowed to crawl the page, but the question PageFed is asking is if Google was able to crawl this page. Sometimes there's a server issue or a technical issue that prevents Google from being able to make a successful fetch of that page. So in that case, you would see a problem here and you would know that there's something you need to dig into and figure out what's going on. Finally, you can see whether or not indexing is allowed. In this case, it is allowed, but if you saw that it wasn't allowed, that means there's a Meta Robots no index tag present on the page that prevents the page from being indexed. Under the indexing section, we can see the canonical tags. The user declared canonical tells you what the canonical tag is on the page as of Google's last crawl. In this case, the user declared canonical matches the inspected URL. The next line tells you what Google has selected as a canonical. In this case, they are selecting the inspected URL as well, so that's what we want to see here. However, you sometimes will see Google selecting a URL that is not the same as the user declared canonical. So in that case, that means that Google is rejecting your canonical tag and they are choosing something else instead. That can happen when there are quality problems with the site content, in particular when there are problems with duplication within the site content. So you want to keep an eye out for that. The next thing we have in the middle section is the video page indexing. This will only show up for pages that have a video present. And in this case, there is a video on our About page, but that video is not being indexed. And if we scroll down, we can see why. The problem is that the video is not the main content of the page. And that's true. On Elementive's About page, the video is part of the content, but it's not the only part of the content on the page. Instead, the video is supplementary. It's supporting the other content that exists. Now, in our case, that's what we expect. We don't intend for that video on our About page to be a key part of our organic search strategy. If, however, that video is part of your organic search strategy, then the video not being indexed is a pretty big problem, and you need to see what kind of changes you need to make so that Google understands that video is part of the main content on the page. Going back to the URL inspection report, we've been looking at the crawled data. That's the data as of Google's last crawl. But if you've recently made changes to that page, you want to know if Google is going to be able to crawl and index that page with those changes reflected. So for that, we can use the live test. Come up here to the side and then click on Test Live URL. This will run a live test of the URL where Google will go and fetch that page in real time, and it will look at the page as it is right now. Now we're looking at the tested version of the page. So we can click on View Tested Page, and we can view the HTML as currently tested. Here again, you want to compare that HTML to what you expect and what you see in the browser to make sure there's no issues present. With a live test, you can also see a screenshot, so you can see what Google is seeing on the page. The screenshot is not available when you look at the crawled version of the data. This is only available under live test. And as you scroll through the screenshot, you want to make sure everything looks correct in the page's design. We also have a few more options under More Info for a live test than we did when viewing the crawled page. Here again, we have the HTTP response, but we can also view the page resources, and we can view any JavaScript issues that are present in the console. Page resources can be pretty helpful to understand if there's any issues with them loading the JavaScript files on the site. In this case, there's a few issues with Google not crawling analytics tags, but that's as expected. Google is not supposed to crawl analytics tags. Under the middle section, we can see whether or not Google can index this page in its current state. So if we expand this, we can see whether or not the crawl is allowed, if the fetch was successful, whether or not indexing allowed, and what Google found as the canonical tag in this live test. We can also see whether or not Google discovered the video on this page or not. If you have made recent changes to the page, you can click Request Indexing. This will tell Google that you want them to re-index the page, recheck the page, and move it back into the index. And sometimes that can be helpful to get the page updated more quickly, though it doesn't always work. If you have any questions about using URL inspection, using other reports in Google Search Console, or more generally have questions about technical SEO, please let me know. You can email me at matthew@elementive.com.